Alright, in this video we're going to put our configuration system into use. We're actually going to look at the game class, and we're going to address our config system, initialize it, and load some values out of it. So moving down here to our game1 class file, let's jump down to our game's constructor. And let's see, we'll jump in right after we get all of our path information established. As soon as we do, let's address the new config class. So we'll say config, and the first thing we need to do is we need to call the setConfigFile method to get our XML file associated and loaded. So we will run setConfigFile, and then we need to specify the absolute path to the config file. Now, of course,
which is in our content folder.
Yes, we store that in content. We've got our content path here, so we'll use a path.combine to join this path with the name of our XML document. So we'll call path.combine, and we'll pass in global state.content path, and we'll join that with a literal string value of config.xml.
Okay.
Simply matching the name of our config file.
Easy enough.
Then one more closing parenthesis to take care of the setConfigFile call. And then at that point, internally, the config system will now have access to it. We'll have loaded, parsed, and have access to all of the information inside of that XML document. All right, moving on from here, we can now make a second call to config.loadOptions. Because at this point, it's ready to go, so we can instruct to begin walking through the individual values and pulling them out of their respective XML nodes. Now, once we have run this, we should have some values available to us, and we can immediately put those into action and use them to set the screen resolution and even to establish our option of starting up in full screen mode. So let's jump in here right after we establish the graphics instance, the graphics device manager. Let's turn around and we'll set our graphics preferred back buffer width and height in order to set the resolution. So we'll say graphics.preferred back buffer width will be equal to config.screenResX. Then we'll jump back and we'll simply duplicate this line so that we can set our preferred back buffer height.
That's close.
That's also close. That's what I get for staring at my notes and trying to type at the same time.
No, it's all good, man. Don't worry about it.
And this buffer height will need to link up to screenResY. Now, after we get the resolution set up, we'll jump down and we'll add an if statement to decide whether or not we want to jump into full screen mode. So we'll say that if config.startupFullScreen, if that is true, then we'll tell our graphics device manager to toggle full screen mode with a call to toggle full screen.
So basically, without that, it's always going to be windowed.
Right. So this is what we need to put that start full screen option into effect.
Okay.
Now, before we actually run through this, I do want to run a debug session on config just to make sure that the values that we think we should get are what are actually being loaded. So what we'll do is we can build briefly, make sure there's no errors. Then jump into config, the class, then jump down to the load options method where I'll drop a breakpoint on our first line with screenResX. Then we can go ahead and run the game. Of course, load options is getting called, and so we immediately hit that breakpoint. Now we can look in here and see that our XML config is set. It has a whole bunch of interesting stuff that has been initialized. We have successfully loaded our XML document. And currently, screenResX has its default value of 0. Now we'll use F10 to step over this line. Now if we look at the value again, we can see that it is still 0, indicating that there is an error at some point. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to let this run to the end just so I can see what the exception we're getting here is. And let me comment these lines out. So again, once again, this is the reason that I ran through in debug mode first, is just to clean up any little glitches that might still be present. So we'll comment these out real quick. We'll run the game, and we'll see nothing is getting shown to the log, though we aren't actually returning anything. So let's look in here really briefly and see what might be causing that. Let's actually jump into getNodeValue and set a breakpoint in here. So node is indeed set. We're returning node attributes. What attributes do we have? We have one attribute, and value here is 908.
So that's working.
So that's working. Let's check parse int now. Let's jump down to parse int, run to here, make it the value 908. We return that, and I see.
Not returning.
There we go. So in the last lesson, we were missing a good deal of return statements. Throughout the creation of all of our parse methods, just glancing at it here, we are missing return statements on each of the methods, except for some of the ones where we got into more complex scenarios.
So easy we overlooked it.
So what was happening is we were always utilizing the default values. So we will simply drop in some return statements in front of parse bools return, parse int return, and parse floats return. Looking down, we have parse vector2, which is returning, and we have parse color, which is returning. So back to the top, let's again set a breakpoint on our screen res x value, run the game one last time, and see if everything is patched up and working. So if we step over this, we have 908.
Yeah.
Screen res y goes from 0 to, let me get the tooltip, to 681. Full screen goes from false, and it should end up staying at false because false is the value in the config file. So now we can run the game. Let's uncomment our lines back in the game. And now we should be able to run with no problems. As a matter of fact, now you can see our larger screen resolution in full effect. Now let's do a few more tests because, of course, at this point, we have only tested the Boolean and integer conversions, and it would be a good idea to test everything else out. First up, just to make sure that our Boolean value is indeed working, let's drop in a value of true, and then we will reestablish a breakpoint, this time on startup full screen. We'll jump in and run. We'll see if full screen goes from false to true.
Nice.
Now, I'm not actually going to let it finish out the initialization of the game here, only because we've got the full recording environment going.
Sure.
I just wanted to make sure that the value did get loaded. So we'll hit Shift F5 and we'll jump out and stop debugging. We'll go to config. We'll set this back to the correct value of false. Now, we still need to test floating point values, vector2s, and colors. So what I'm going to do is we'll make a series of nodes here in our XML document to test these values. So we can begin with something called test float, and we can make an attribute called value, and we can set that to something like maybe 10.2. Then we'll end off the tag, we'll close it out, and we can also do a test vector. We'll set its value equal to a series of numbers separated by a comma. We'll do maybe 34, 55.7. I'll throw one of these elements in as a floating point value just to make sure that we maintain that floating point all the way into the vector2. And again, we'll close out the node. And one final node, we'll have our test color. And we'll set this equal to a value of 255 by 128 by 0. So we should get kind of an orange type color, maybe orangish yellow or yellowish. And we'll wrap these off. So we have 3 values in use. Now let's turn back to our config class and make sure that we can load each of these in. So we'll actually jump in here, go down one line, and we'll make a series of local variables. Because again, we don't need to store these, and we'll be pulling them out as soon as we verify them. So we'll make a float local variable called test float. And we'll set this equal to this series of method calls. Again, we'll retype them out just to make sure that all of these are working. So we need to, as a final step, parse out a float. The result we're going to be parsing will be gathered from getNodeValue. We'll pass in our XML config instance, and we'll give a path. And let's see. At this point, I will get a little bit lazy. I'll grab an existing path.
That's a lot to type.
And we'll put in the value test float. close off our call to get node value, close off our call to parse float, terminate, and there we go. And I'll turn around and we'll go ahead and establish test vector and test color as well. So we'll copy, duplicate this line a few times. We'll give ourselves a vector2 for test vector. We'll make sure that this is also the name of the node we're addressing, test vector. And finally, we'll make a color variable called test color, and we'll address the node test color. We'll build, and let's see. Oh, and we're missing the different parse routines. Of course, we need parse vector. Let's see, parse vector2 and parse color. Now everything builds fine. Before we run, since these are obviously not used anywhere, I'll drop a breakpoint on test float. We'll run. Test float is currently 0. If we step over this, we load in the value 10.2. And you can even see down here in the locals. If we watch test vector, currently it's x and y are 0. If we step over again, now we have 34 and 55.7. Nice. So we are indeed getting that floating point value here as well. And finally, test color. Red, green, blue, and alpha are all 0. And then if we run, we get red, green, and blue all loaded in. And alpha is actually getting initialized to 255 or completely opaque.
So it looks like all of your parses are working.
One last thing to test. I'm going to jump out of this debug session. The last thing is to make sure that we can handle a color with an alpha specified. So I'll say maybe comma 64. So we give that fourth number we're feeding in. We'll drop a breakpoint directly onto test color, run, we go from all zeros, step over, and we can see that alpha is read in.
Very nice.
So we have verified all of these additional loading mechanisms. Let's pull out our test code now. We don't want this lying around when we get to the actual game, so we'll pull out our test float vector and color.
Also pull it out of the XML.
And then we'll jump to the config XML and pull out these fields as well.
Cool.
So we'll make sure that we can build once again. We have no errors. We do have working configuration. And so that is going to wrap up our config system.
Awesome.